we can. Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues which affect Guyanese everywhere in the diaspora and at home. And in this particular month, we observe what we can say is African Guyanese history events, because we feel that the whole of August and for some time thereafter, going all the way up to November, African Guyanese made a powerful contribution to the evolution of the Guyanese nation. And we feel that it is fit and proper that we should continue our educational program for young Guyanese so they could understand what happened in the past in order to make their future better. And on this program, we'll be looking at the village movement because it is our view that villages transformed what used to be plantations into a nation. And every day in the news, you see something affecting the villages of Guyana. So we must find out what happened in the past and try to make life better for people in the villages in the future. As you know, the village movement is a process that occurred after Africans gained their emancipation in 1838, 185 years ago. But once they were freed from, the shackles of enslavement, they bought, these are illiterate folk, they bought a number of plantations and created human settlements. This is the first time it's happening in Guyana. The movement transformed what I would call an archipelago of plantations into a chain of human settlements stretching from the Corentyne in the east to the Pomeroon in the west, all along the coastal belt. What we see, my friends, is that in a little over a decade, between roughly 1838 and 1848 or thereabouts, many poor peasants who had just come out of enslavement, almost all of them were illiterate. They were able to subscribe $1 million in 1839 money to buy over 6,000 hectares of land to create their communities. And these are the communities which present-day Guyanese have inherited along the coastline particularly. What we see then is almost half of the African population moving out of the plantation, not abandoning plantation work, but moving physically out of the plantation into these free settlements and converting these settlements into villages in which the people actually related with one another. So they came together, and in almost what you may regard now as a financial miracle, they were able to pool their coins, because those days the coins had real value. Guilders were made of real silver, and people stored, the coins just as you would store jewelry today. So they pooled their coins, and you all know the legend of going to the town to pay for the purchase of the plantations with the coins in wheelbarrows. Some of them still have mud because they were buried, buried in the backyards. Some of the villages were communal, that is, they were bought by all of the proprietors collectively. That is to say, they were undivided. And some were proprietary, that is, they were individual purchases. Unfortunately, some of the communal villages had problems because the original proprietors died and the properties had to be passed to the children, what people call children property. And again, that property was undivided in legal terms. Sometimes they set aside land for communal pasturage. So nobody owned it. And I think in present-day Guyana, outsiders have tried to claim that land because they didn't comprehend how the original villagers intended to use that land. So we have a lot of problems still with villages or plantations which were purchased communally. There's not so many problems with the proprietary villages, but I don't want to get involved in that at the present time. A commission of inquiry was convened to iron out the anomalies and prevent abuses in the ownership of African ancestral lands. That is another matter that we'll deal with. We tend to regard the 7th of November, 1839, as I would say, the landmark event in the village movement. That was the date on which Plantation Northbrook was purchased. As you know, Plantation Northbrook was renamed Victoria Village. On that day, 83 men and women, bear this in mind, this was not a men-only activity or enterprise. Men and women from 5 plantations, Ansgrove, Dutchford, Enmore, Hope, and Paradise, agreed to pay 30,000 guilders, silver guilders. At that time, although Guyana was united as British Guyana, we still use the Dutch currency, which is the guilder. And you may hear old folk songs, people singing about guilders, because old folk, that's the money they knew, guilders. They agreed to pay 30,000 guilders to buy Plantation Northbrook. And they were able to save that money. Where did the money come from? The money came from the market days. They would sell a few cows, they would sell a sheep hair, a few ducks, they would sell some ground provisions, and they would save that money. They were thrifty people. They weren't, drunkards and party goers. They were thrifty people who saved that money. So from the year after emancipation, they were able to accumulate 30,000 guilders to buy Plantation Northbrook. And as you know, the story goes, it was renamed Victoria Village. My friends, you can see, therefore, from the outset that the village movement was not something that was created by an elite. It was not something that was created by the government. It is not something that was created by some organization of consultants. It was created by ordinary people, poor people, illiterate people, men and women, not scholars, not the governors, poor people. They had a vision of living in freedom and in free villages. So the village became an institution that eventually caught fire all along the coast and transformed all of these plantations, a place of whips and chains, a place of degradation and punishment, into free villages. It was almost a historical miracle in terms of the evolution of our country. The village, therefore, there's a saying that, that it takes a village. Well, it took a village to make Guyana into a nation. And the village played a central role in the evolution, not only of families, but also of the entire local government system. It played a role in the evolution of enterprise, of education, of housing, of fostering social cohesion, of communal solidarity. The village, for a long time, maybe the first 100 years or so, was the only place people knew. They never traveled, further afield. They never crossed rivers or went to the hinterland. So the village was, in fact, the whole world. That's where they lived. That's where their parents lived. That's where their relatives lived, and that's where they worked, and that's where they worshipped. We see that, therefore, the village movement was more than a physical movement of people from one place to the next. It was not a geographical movement only. It was also a cultural movement. because people were able to come together in groups that respected one another. It wasn't an imposition, it wasn't a housing scheme. It was a voluntary association of poor people. Um, it was an economic movement because they realized from the outset that breaking from the plantations would involve economic independence. That is, they had to grow their own food because they could no longer subsist on the stuff that the plantations fed them, which of course tended not to be adequate because for several decades the plantations could not import products such as mackerel or herring or flour to feed them, and they started to feed themselves with breadfruit, ground provisions, and fish that they could catch, and the livestock that they bred. So it was an economic institution in which the villagers realized from the outset that they had to feed themselves. It was also a social institution. Remarkably, during the period of enslavement, many African families were split up. To start with, they were not allowed to marry until after the 1820s. It meant that the father could go to Wakinam, or the mother could go to quarantine. The children could be left somewhere in West Bank. So once they were free, the fathers took the lead in reassembling their families. There are stories of fathers walking from Wakinam all the way back to East Coast, to Friendship and other villages, in order to get their families together again, get their children together again, to reconstitute the families which had been split asunder by enslavement. So the village was an important role in played an important role in reassembling families, and also further in bringing people who had known one another before together, and they started to bond. That is why the relations in villages are so strong up to the present time. Sometimes, you'd see people in one village, many of them are related to each other. Sometimes calling the elders uncle and auntie is not just for courtesy, it is, it represents a blood tie. And as I've said in previous discussions with you, the villages were erected on four pillars. First, of course, is the home. And the fact is that during the period of enslavement, the homes were not homes at all. They were hovels. They're not huts, they're hovels. They were not fit for people to live in because the plantation proprietors did not construct homes for them. The enslaved Africans had to go in the bush and get some wood and bush and make some type of shanty. And of course, if they had livestock, the livestock had to stay inside. It was very unhealthy, very insanitary. And so for the first time, they were able to build proper homes. Of course, they couldn't go to the sawmill. They had to go and cut wood and build the homes in these new settlements. And if you see some of the photographs of the old villages, you realize how difficult circumstances were, especially during floods. The homes were important, not because of their appearance, but because they contained a unit called the family. Second, they had to feed themselves. And in planning the villages, they provided farms for all of the proprietors. So even though the proprietor may live in the front, he also had a farm at the back. That is the origin of back dam, because no proprietor would get a homestead and a farm at the same place. And because the quality of land varied, you'd see that those who lived in the front had to go by bateau or some form of canoe to the back dam where the farm was. Sometimes one allocation might be split in three parts. This again caused legal problems. especially when somebody died and maybe the back dam was abandoned. Again, some of those problems are with us today in 2023. But the farms were important for sustenance or subsistence, if you want to call it that. Third, of course, was the church, and the church had formed an important uh, role or played an important role in the lives of African Guyanese from the first decade of the 19th century. And I've paid tribute before to the London Missionary Society, which is the mother of the Congregational Church that we know today in Guyana. And several dozen congregational churches, what they call the A to Z, all through the coast. And they not only taught biblical studies, but they also have to teach African Guyanese. So from Albion Chapel right down to Zoar Congregational Church in Plaisance, A to Z, you'd find congregational churches, and they stood by the Africans through the dark days of enslavement. But those churches had to be built by the people themselves. These were not built by any government or any international body. They were built by the people. And it was something sincere, it was something genuine, because the original proprietors were grateful to God for freeing them from the worst crime against humanity, the worst system that has been known to modern man, the system of slavery. And over and over again in the writings, you see them thanking God, for their salvation. And even now, you go to some of the African villages, and as I often say, you throw a stone in the air and you probably land on a church. And of course, there are many more churches other than the congregational churches now. Some of them have stood the test of time and have been very faithful to the African community. And the fourth pillar was, of course, the pillar of the school. Again, many people who are not familiar with African Guyanese history don't understand what happened after 1838. The males very prudently withdrew their women from plantation work and withdrew their children from plantation work. So rather than have whole families committed to cutting cane, the men continued to cut cane, and the women bore the responsibility of setting up the farms, the kitchen gardens and the farms. And the children, to a greater or lesser degree, had to go to school. So this was an important element in the evolution of the villages, that the women were no longer tied to working on the cane in the plantation, but they were able to build their homes and build their families. And the children were able to start attending school. It didn't happen in a flash, but people did not want to repeat or replicate the type of existence they had on the sugar plantation. The plantation itself was not a pleasant place. It was an arena of exploitation, of confrontation, and degradation. And they continued to work, but they were glad to get away from what the plantation stood for. I would like to pay special tribute to Victoria. We've been taught in our schools that Victoria is our first village. Perhaps it wasn't, but symbolically it was. It was a landmark event, the establishment of Victoria, and it was a monument to the village movement and to human freedom. We like to say that Victoria pioneered local government because the residents of Victoria, the original proprietors, as they were called before the purchasers started to die off, actually drafted or had drafted for them a set of regulations as early as 1842. And these regulations and if you listen to if you read the regulations, and there's a little book by William Arno, which could tell you, which reprinted the whole text, the entire text of the regulations. Um, the regulations provided for the collection of taxes. The regulation prohibited cursing in the villages. They prohibited drunkenness in the villages. They prohibited gambling. They prohibited swearing. So you can see that these forefathers were serious people. And on Sundays, you couldn't make noise. These villages were well organized and very orderly. And of course, they provided also for the election of office bearers. So they were well regulated. And the model of Victoria Village regulations, which were maintained for some, the model which was maintained for some time, would be a good model for people to use nowadays, especially the prohibition of cursing, drunkenness, gambling, and so on. But I must say that several other villages have questioned, the designation of Victoria as the first village. I know for one, Queenstown village in Essequibo, and I think Bucks and Friendship and Litchfield. Many of these villages had actually been the site of the coming together of free persons, some of them even before actual emancipation, but they were not registered, they were not legally purchased. So I'm not going to start a quarrel now, but what happened is that in several areas, people had started to live together in communities, real communities, away from the plantations prior to 7th of November 1839. But as I said, Victoria is symbolic because it was a landmark case, and many other villages were established in the wake of Victoria after 1939. As I said, people pooled, $1 million and were able to buy thousands of hectares, hundreds of hectares of land. Most important also is the fact that the village movement, because people were freed from the backbreaking labor and the degradation of the plantation, was able to stimulate a cultural renaissance. Poor as they were, villages were able to establish and maintain a viable level of economic development because they had to, they had to feed themselves. This is very important. And they did this through the establishment of agricultural societies, not just farms, but agricultural societies. They held annual fairs, and they would sell and exchange the best animals, the best fruit, the best vegetables, and the best preserves. And this is a practice that existed right into the 1960s. And the APNU AFC administration revived it in the form of the RACE, Regional Agricultural and Cultural Exhibition. And many regions, I know for sure Region 2, Region 5, Region 4, Region 6, Region 7, and Region 9, they encouraged villagers to bring their produce to exchange or to sell. And it's a joy to see the ability of housewives and farmers to produce these goods, knowing that there was a market in which these goods could be sold. So there was not only a cultural renaissance because people were proud of the culture. They weren't deculturized. People had to produce food, and they had fairs, and they started to produce preserves, the famous guava jam, guava jelly, and so on. And they had different types of of activities which were not possible in the plantations. There were, of course, challenges, and we in the APNU AFC brought a motion in Parliament on the 7th of November 2013, when I was in the opposition, calling on the PPP administration, because we were still on the PPP government at the time, to designate the 7th of November as National Day of Villages. That is the importance we pay to the village and the village movement. The aim of that motion, which was approved by Parliament because the APNU and AFC had the majority, but it was not assented to by the PPP, which had the presidency. But the aim was to pay homage to the purchasers of the villages and to promote a national appreciation of the village movement at all levels. And unfortunately, as I said, although the motion was approved by the National Assembly, by majority, of course, the president of the day refused to give assent to it. But of course, in 2015, there was a new president, and he gave his assent. That's now why we have now 7th of November as the National Day of Villages. The village movement, therefore, was an important event in Guyanese history, but it was not without challenges. From the start, there were impediments, and purposefully, the plantation owners wanted to drive the peasants, the new peasants, back onto the plantation. They flooded the fields, and they sometimes dug up the ground provision plots in order to prevent the emergence of a prosperous peasantry, because they felt that the peasantry would pull labor away from the plantations into the villages. And as you know, the very year of emancipation, they started to bring Indians. A few years earlier, they brought Portuguese from Madeira, and then in 1853, they brought Chinese laborers. But there was always a labor shortage on the plantations. But the techniques they used against the freed Africans, created a lot of bitterness. And in addition to that, the European planters, of course, controlled the legislature, the court of policy, as it was called then. And they imposed a lot of legal obstacles on the villagers, including taxation. Sometimes just to operate a canoe, you had to buy a license. In order to operate a cart, you had to buy a license. And they felt by these measures, not only would the government be enriched, but the peasantry would be impoverished. By the time the APNU AFC got into office in 2015, there was a lot of work to be done. We introduced village improvement plans. We introduced what we call the regional agriculture commercial exhibitions. We introduced the rural enterprise and agricultural development projects. We introduced the regional economic action plan. And we also appointed a minister in charge of rural affairs. This is the first time, of course, it's been abolished now, but it's the first time we had a minister looking at the villages, particularly to ensure that the impediments to their development were removed. And as I said, some of that has been halted now, but the villages still need the support of central government. They don't need to be opposed by central government. They don't need to be dominated by central government. They need to develop a partnership with the central government for the good of the people. Most Guyanese still live in villages. And for those of you who are African Guyanese, most African Guyanese don't live in Georgetown, New Amsterdam, and Linden. They live in villages. And that emphasizes or underlines the importance of villages. What is the way forward? 2/3 of Guyanese live in villages. That's a fact. And a lot of persons living on the coastline owe their places of residence, and also many persons, even in high office, owe their places of birth, or have as their places of birth the villages. A process which started, nearly 180 years ago. with a single person of a single plantation. That not only laid the foundation or for the incubation of a nation, but many people are proud of the villages produced two chancellors of judiciary. Chancellor Messiah came from Port Drawing in West Demerara, and Chancellor Desiree Bernard came from Plaisance in East Demerara. So let us look to see in a nutshell how the villages could be strengthened at this point in time, 2023. We are talking about the present, we're not talking about the past. We feel that village economies can flourish, and we look towards micro enterprise, medium scale enterprise to generate industries, agro businesses particularly, to provide employment. We feel that employment is important. Many young people in the villages do not have gainful employment, and much more could be done to facilitate their access to farming, by proper drainage and transportation to the back dam. They can produce goods again. They can provide services again. Village lands can bloom again, and they can be placed under cultivation and encouraged, and farmers could be encouraged to produce more food. Because in Guyana, there's a food security issue. It's good to grow roses and millet and sorghum, but it's better to produce food that people need on a day-to-day basis. Sweet potatoes, planting cassava, pumpkin, and so on. Enterprise is important. Villages can become economically viable units. Villages are not dormitories where people go to sleep. These must be communities that are based on economic produce. There is profit in farming, there's profit in village enterprise, there's profit in agro processing, there's profit in marketing. And also, we need to strengthen empowerment. In June this year, we had what is called local government elections. But we need to look at local government elections from a functional point of view. It is not a political contest. It is a means of empowerment of ordinary villages. So regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their background, they can sit around a table and say, what is best for our village? And that is what local empowerment is. They must all be involved in decision making. It's not about domination. It's not about one Guyana and you must come into this organization or that organization. What is best for the village? That is what empowerment means. Village democracy can flourish through regular local government elections, and the APNU AFC historically is proud of restoring local government elections, which had been abandoned by the PPPC administration for over 20 years. And it gives them the opportunity to select the leaders who care for their communities and who really represent their constituencies, not people who are imposed by some central committee somewhere or the other. And it is a base for social cohesion. Villages can be happy communities. And many Guyanese are surprised to learn that people like Eugene Karai are Bostonians, and they all grew up in a community with many ethnic groups. A former bishop of the Roman Catholic Church, Bishop Benedict Singh, is a Bostonian. So we must not feel that there is some form of race war taking place in Guyana. We have come from a past where these villages were actually meeting ground for people of different ethnicity, and people are proud of their communities, people are proud of their origin. In conclusion, I would say that we lose a lot when we lose the vitality and the vibrancy of villages. The villages and the village movement enabled our foreparents to provide a better future for us and their descendants. African Guyanese in particular, all Guyanese, because they're non-African villages as well, all Guyanese must continue to be conscious of the groundwork which is needed to provide a good life for everyone, present and future generations, through villages. Thank you, and may God bless you all.
Together can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must